Good morning, afternoon, or evening to all, and welcome to this session on judging the climate crisis, the role of the International Court of Justice in addressing environmental harm. My name is Jorge Viñuales. I'm a professor in Cambridge, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this panel with colleagues and friends, Lavanya Rajamani, Christina Voigt, and Solomon Yeo. In a moment, I will be introducing each of them to the audience, but before we go there, I would like to briefly situate the focus of this session. As many people in the audience will know, in the last 2 decades, there has been a lot of effort to bring a number of cases, particularly before domestic courts around the world, in the United States and elsewhere, and to some extent also in international courts and tribunals, particularly human rights courts and bodies. Yet, in this context, the International Court of Justice has not yet made any pronouncement or been given a role in this process of international adjudication. It is not because there had been no attempts in time to do that, because even as early as March 2002, Tuvalu's Prime Minister Toloa Kalake had announced an initiative to sue the United States and Australia, perhaps together with Kiribati and the Maldives, in connection with sea level rise. Then again, in 2012, in February, the president of Palau, Johnson Toribiong, announced in a speech at the UN General Assembly that he would seek an advisory opinion from the ICJ on the question of climate change. More recently, Vanuatu's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ralph Regenbanu, announced in a statement at the Climate Vulnerable Forum that his government had the intention to explore legal action against a number of both states and non-state actors in connection with loss and damage suffered in Vanuatu. I guess that this is the current situation where one can place a more recent initiative by a grassroots youth movement campaign that was launched at the Pacific Island Forum, and that started in March of 2019 to request an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice on the issues of climate change and human rights. So this is the context in which we would like to address what could be a pronouncement, a useful pronouncement. What can we expect from the court if the court was given a chance to take a stance on the different issues raised by climate change. Rather than a sequential presentation, this session will be a moderated discussion between the three panelists. So we hope that an interactive dialogue between all the panels, and then during the conference, the annual meeting of ASIO, also the participants, because it's going to be a continue the conversation option. We hope that that is going to be tease out the most interesting issues, and despite the fact that this is being pre-recorded, we're trying to give the topic a lively tonality, a lively edge to it. So with that in mind, I will now briefly introduce the distinguished and representative panel that we have to discuss these issues, and I will do that in alphabetical order and very briefly, because time is always better spent on substance. So Professor Lavanya Rajamani is a professor of international environmental law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Oxford. She is an authority in the area of international environmental law, and more specifically in climate change law. She published an award-winning book together with Jutta Brunet and Dan Bodansky on the international law of climate change. She is a lead coordinating author for the IPCC 6th assessment report. And among her very wide activities in the policy circles, she has advised the UNFCCC Secretariat, the Alliance of Small Island States, and she was part also, and that's very important, of the UNFCCC core drafting and advisory team for the Paris Agreement. Professor Christina Voigt is a professor at the Department of Public and International Law at the University of Oslo. She is a chairperson of the Climate Change Specialist Group of the World Commission on Environmental Law at IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and a co-chair of the Paris Agreements Committee to facilitate implementation and promote compliance. That's a technical name. It's a compliance committee. Christina has published very extensively. She's an authority in international environmental law, and she was deeply involved in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement as well, particularly in connection with the preamble. Solomon Yeo is a campaign director of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change Initiative. He's in many ways the reason why we're here and we're talking about these things, because together with a number of students, he masterminded the initiative to request an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice. Solomon is from the Solomon Islands, and he graduated with a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Arts in Politics in 2009 from the University of South Pacific. So he has a double degree and a double background, both in international politics and international law. And he's a very dedicated campaigner. He's really focusing on addressing climate change and inequality and giving a voice to the Pacific youth in all the platforms, including this one. Hopefully we'll be able to flesh out that voice as much as possible. So without further ado, this is going to be the panel that will discuss a number of questions. And I will start by perhaps asking Solomon a question. Solomon, can you tell us a bit more about the origins of the initiative and the key expectations of youth movements from the ICJ pronouncement? You have the floor, Solomon. I think you're muted. Yes, that's fine.
Good day and good night to you all. And thank you very much, Jorge, for the kind introduction and welcome. As you have alluded, turning back time to 2012, the government of Palau did announce that they were going to pursue a UN General Assembly resolution on seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change. However, no serious action followed suit until in 2019, when a group of concerned and environmental law students from the University of South Pacific gathered to research into legal initiatives that they believe could break the political impasse that we're facing in the climate change debate. And after review of the Palau initiative and much more research, the students wrote to the leaders, governments of the Pacific Island Forum, including New Zealand and Australia, to support the students' proposal and to take the initiative to the United Nations General Assembly. But as stubborn optimists we are then and still today, letters were not enough, and students felt like more could be done, hence leading to the formation of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change and the initiation of the Pacific Youth ICJO campaign. Since our formation, the students have been campaigning extensively within our region in the Pacific and beyond. The collective efforts have seen the proposal receiving support of many Pacific governments, with the Vanuatu government as the championing state in the Pacific. Also, the initiative sought to the widespread support of eminent legal experts and academics. Over 130 plus Pacific CSOs have supported the initiative as well, international non-state actors and inspiring youth from all over the world to also take upon the campaign in their respective countries and region. And together with the newfound alliance of youth, the Pacific youth and the global youth formed together the World's Youth for Climate Justice, which is the umbrella network for the global youth campaign on the ICJO. But yes, thank you.
Thanks, Solomon. Christina, as you know, there have been a number of initiatives in the past to try to bring the ICJ to say something about climate change. Do you think the moment is ripe, or is there any difference right now and any different prospect of success of this initiative?
Thank you for this question, Jorge. And before I answer, I just wanted to say hello to everyone, and I thank you for your very kind introduction. And I'd like to congratulate ASIL for including this very important topic in this year's annual conference. It is a pleasure and a great privilege being here with you today, and I'm looking forward to discussing this issue with my common friends on the panel. Jorge, your question was, is the moment ripe? Is the time ripe? I think it is maturing. I wouldn't say it's ripe yet, so you can just pick the fruit, but it is maturing. And I think there are 5 reasons for why we see a maturing momentum. The first reason is that the science is really clear. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, especially with its 1.5 degree warming report degree from 2018, but also with the upcoming 6th assessment report, has never been clearer than now on the causes of climate change and the expected effects depending on what level of warming we're looking at. So the science is clear. And the IPCC also states what pathways are necessary to keep warming somewhere between 1.5 and well below 2 degrees. So this is really important scientific basis on which any litigation would be built. The second reason for that maturing momentum is that political decision-making is painstakingly slow. It is gaining some momentum, but it is, it's waxing and it's waning, it's going forward and in some places backward. And that creates some frustration because it's an urgent issue to address, but politics is moving very, very slowly. And there are concerns about this. And the third reason is that the impacts of climate change are becoming tangible all over the world. We're seeing this every day. We just have to listen to the weather forecast. We are seeing issues that are already affecting people today. And we know that this is going to increase in intensity and magnitude and will affect disproportionately young people who live into this uncertain future. And the fourth reason is that international negotiations under the UN that resulted in the Paris Agreement have only marginally addressed that question of what happens if climate change harm actually occurs and impacts countries and people worldwide. And there are no further negotiations really expected on that crucial issue. So there is an unaddressed and unclarified legal question that actually gives rise to a need for clarification, either by an authoritative source as the International Court of Justice or any other international court. So we have state obligations that are kind of fuzzy and demand clarification. And I think we need to see that ripening momentum in light of these 5 reasons.
Thanks so much, Christina. Lavanya, you're right in the middle of the IPCC and one of the very few lawyers, actually. I'm not even sure that there are any other lawyers there, in particular international lawyers. What is the view from the inside on the connection between the science? Is the moment ripe when you look at it from that perspective?
Thank you, Jorge, for that question. And like Christina, I'd also like to say hello to everyone and to say that it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. And I'm really very grateful to ASIL for giving us an opportunity to have this discussion in this context, in this fora. So a couple of responses, Jorge. On the science, I'd also like to agree with Christina. The 6th assessment report, which is due out in various stages over the course of the next 18 months, is brought together by over 700 authors from over 90 countries. 45% of them are developing country scientists. This is going to be the authoritative work on the state of the scientific literature in this area, and it's the excellent and a very authoritative basis for which basis on which any litigation can be built. So I think that's a very important starting point. And of course, this report is building on past reports, including the 1.5 degree report, which Christina also mentioned. So from the scientific perspective, there is authoritative science out there that this litigation can build on. And that is, I think, an important starting point for this. In terms of the international negotiations, I'd also like to sort of underscore one of the points that Christina made. I think the international negotiations have reached a point of diminishing marginal returns. So we do have an architecture out there. We do have the Paris Agreement, which is in place and which has almost universal ratification, especially now with the Americans back in the fold. The multi-year sort of rulemaking process has all but concluded. There are only sort of rules on markets that are left to be concluded, important, but only one aspect of the rules that are left to be concluded. The core obligations are in place, the rules and the institutional architecture is in place, and we're now in an implementation sort of phase in the international negotiations. And the rules themselves don't address the full spectrum of legal obligations that arise in relation to climate change for states. They address, as Christina's pointed out, a sort of subset of those obligations. So it's important for the International Court of Justice to step in at this point and put the Paris Agreement and the legal obligations within it in the context of the customary international obligations that also states are obliged to and under and obliged to perform. So I think it's an important point of entry for the International Court of Justice right now.
Thanks, Melanie. Yes, I completely agree. I think that this is not just business as usual. I mean, things have changed a lot in the last decade, particularly. Let me move now to another question that I would like to raise for the three of you, and particularly perhaps if we can start with Christina, because Christina, you negotiated part of the Paris Agreement, particularly the preamble, which has different interesting features, among which the first reference in the climate law to human rights. And the initiative that Solomon was talking about earlier is really has a very strong focus on the issues of human rights of present and future generations. So what do you think, what could be an interesting pronouncement? What do you think that the court could say about the connection between climate change and human rights?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's quite a comprehensive question to address. I mean, just because you point to the preamble of the Paris Agreement, and I mean, for those in the audience who may not have the agreement before them, there is in the preamble indeed a reference to human rights, and it's the first human rights reference in the realm of binding international climate treaties, and it's in the preamble paragraph 11 for those who want to find it, where it says that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. And then there follows a whole list of different rights and stakeholders. Now, it's very interesting that it is where it is and says what it says. And I think I want to just point out that it says, it isn't kind of a reminder to parties that whatever they do to address climate change, they need not to forget the existing human rights obligations, which they already have under international or regional human rights law, or even in their national constitutions, or even under customary law. These obligations exist and they cannot be pushed aside by taking measures to address climate change. This is basically what that preamble paragraph says. Now, it is, as I said, kind of a reminder to states, you have human rights obligations. Please, don't ignore them, remember them. And this is the next point. States have obligations to protect human rights, respect and promote and fulfill. They have negative obligations not to intentionally violate human rights, but they also have positive obligations to create conditions that enable citizens to enjoy their existing human rights. And we can think of a whole host of human rights depending on what instrument we're looking at. It could be right to life, right to health, right to be free from discrimination, but also in some regions we have a human right to a clean and healthy environment. For example, in the inter-American setting, something we don't really have within the European setting, but there are discussions on it. Now, it's important to look at what these obligations are. What do states have to do in order to prevent citizens from impacts that could violate their human rights? And of course, climate change in all its impacts will lead to certain human rights obligations when it comes to the enjoyment, for example, of right to health, or even right to life or private life, as we see here within Europe. And in order to take positive measures or to protect positively the obligation or the human rights obligations, states have to take all appropriate and necessary measures in order to avoid any risk to these human rights. And that includes, of course, also taking climate mitigation and adaptation measures. So in order to reduce the risk that climate change poses for citizens, for individuals worldwide to enjoy their human rights. So in defining what these measures are, we have to look at the region, at the treaty at stake. As I said, within Europe, we have a slightly different jurisprudence from the European Court on Human Rights than we have within the American system, where you basically the positive obligation on a due diligence requirement, and which means that states have to take all appropriate and necessary measures to reduce the risk that could affect the enjoyment of human rights. And here in the interpretation, because no international or national human rights treaty is talking about climate change, very few even have an environmental obligation, we have to interpret in the environmental and the climate change challenges. And by interpreting in climate change challenges into human rights treaties, we have to set them against the general legal environment in which they exist and look at pre-existing or existing obligations of parties under other international treaty law, including the Paris Agreement. And if we put these two together, we will see that within the Paris Agreement, we have elements that define expectations or requirements of conduct of how parties should address climate change, in particular when it comes to taking effective domestic measures with the aim of achieving the objectives that parties have put in their NDC, as well as having an NDC which is reflective of each party's highest possible ambition. These are elements that have a due diligence character, and that can be used to measure the standard of care that parties have to adopt in order to live up to their human rights obligations. I think you asked something about the pronouncement that we could expect from the International Court of Justice in this case, if I understood you correctly, Jorge. I'm a little bit skeptical at this moment how far the ICJ would go in addressing human rights violations. We may see it, we may not see it. I think regional human rights courts might be more appropriate forum to look at human rights obligations. But in terms of addressing or pronouncing a judgment, I think something that could sound like, requesting parties to review their domestic legal framework in light of their existing obligations with the aim to raising ambition to the highest possible level. Something like this could be a pronouncement that might be possible from the ICJ.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, I mean, it's complicated to know exactly what the court would come up with, because it would depend on the question as well. What else could you put there? I mean, I'm conscious that probably Solomon will want to say a word, just because there are many expectations about human rights and intergenerational equity. And if the court is shy on that respect, then it would be a bit disappointing. But before we move right there, and I asked that question to Solomon, Lavanya, what else would you see as a useful addition there? I mean, if the court is going to say something, and it is going to feel free to say something which is in the core sort of competence of the court, where would you see that?
I think the core competence of the court will be in terms of sort of clarifying and fructifying the obligations that states have in respect to climate change. And those obligations have to be seen within a particular framework. So, I will perhaps expand on sort of the clarificatory role the ICJ could play in relation to the obligations in the Paris Agreement. But for now, I want to sort of limit my remarks to the human rights dimensions. And I think I tend to agree with Christina. I'm not sure the court will go into this in any depth because of the sort of different obligations that different states have undertaken for themselves. And there is a lot more scope for mining this particular issue in perhaps regional sort of treaty bodies and national courts. But I think at the international level, it's important for the framing and the narrative to be one, and the lens to be one which is human rights focused. So I think it's for the ICJ to recognize that there are linkages between these different fields and to sort of emphasize the linkages between these fields. And then, as Christina suggests, ask states to sort of take their obligations into account when determining how they will respond to the sort of climate change problematic. And the standard of care and due diligence, which I also will speak about later, is something that I think is an important sort of element of the discussion. If I could just add, one of the sort of emerging notions now that is gaining traction is the notion of earth rights, right, and the rights of rivers and mountains. And it's sort of a growing acceptance of earth jurisprudence as such. And while I certainly don't expect the ICJ to pronounce on this, I think it's an important sort of narrative context, an important lens also to keep in mind. Even the Paris Agreement, for instance, did offer a very guarded hat tip to Mother Earth and ecosystem integrity, for instance, in one of its preambular recitals. And like I said, while I don't expect the ICJ to actually pronounce on the rights of nature, it is important context that less anthropocentric approaches to rights are also emerging and gaining ground and need to be kept in focus when we're addressing the issue of climate change.
Thanks, Lavanya. Solomon, would that type of advisory opinion so shy on the issue of human rights, something that is so core to the demands of you young generations and your initiative, would that be a worthy, is it worth having? Do you think it would be far too disappointing? What do you think?
Yes, thank you very much, Jorge, for the question. And Lavanya, I would also like to really add on, before going into Jorge's question, I would really like to draw on the fact that while the perspective of the right of nature is really important, it is of course of equal importance to really recognize the rights of the youth, especially from the global south, who are of course considering the challenges on climate change that these marginalized groups are facing, coupled with the barriers that they're confronted with when voicing out their concern, while also simultaneously advocating for initiatives to advance climate justice. Hence, this is why it's really important to consider this perspective of human rights and climate change, given that human rights are really inalienable, non-negotiable, and it's not based on the lowest common denominator or political convenience. And what is precisely one of the main reasons as to why we, the youth in the Pacific, as well in the world, are seeking an advisory opinion from the ICJ. Coming to the question at hand, I believe that international law is developing in a really incremental and piecemeal fashion that often lead to the separation between different areas of law. The ICJ can really be help in this area in terms of integrating areas that are currently separate, such as human rights and environmental law. And the core role of ICJ advisory opinions is developing and clarifying international law. In the case of human rights and climate change, this will definitely play a really supportive role in terms of enhancing the effectiveness of the international legal system in tackling climate change. And for example, and most importantly, also very important, is by bolstering the authority of human rights bodies to address climate change under their respective mandates.
Interesting. So in other words, if I understand you well, Solomon, a request from the General Assembly to the ICJ about climate change should really have some reference to human rights there.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's part of the expectations. Let's move to the third question that I had broadly, which is much more focused on climate change. And I'll start with Lavanya because she has done so much work on this area and also in the negotiations. So my question, Lavanya, just to start our chat, is what could the ICJ be expected to say specifically on the international law of climate change when one considers it very specifically from the perspective of the three treaties that have been adopted so far?
Thank you, Jorge. That's a great question. And I think it's at the core of what the ICJ could helpfully do going forward. So I think to sort of properly answer this question, we do have to think about what the gaps and ambiguities are in international climate change law. And of course, this is a function of the political situation as it was in 2015, as it has been in the last few decades on climate change and as it's evolving. But the Paris Agreement and the architecture created by the Paris Agreement is exceptional in many ways. It's sort of innovative in many ways, but it does have some very core gaps. And one of these gaps is in relation to ambition, another is in relation to accountability, and the third is in relation to fairness. And I'm going to speak very briefly about each of these. So the ambition gap, and Christina sort of alluded to this earlier as well, the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement is a binding procedural obligation on states to submit nationally determined contributions. And there are three things to note here. First, that these contributions and targets are nationally determined, not multilaterally negotiated, that there is no adequacy review mechanism for these nationally determined contributions, at least not at the individual level, and these are not subject to obligations of result, either in relation in any way. They're not subject to obligations of result. So what this has resulted in is a situation in which the nationally determined contributions are just critically insufficient to meet the purpose of the Paris Agreement, which is identified in Article 2 as holding the temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade and striving towards 1.5 degrees centigrade. So current NDCs, even with the sort of second updated NDCs that about 48 parties have submitted, are putting us on track to 2.6 to 3.3 degrees centigrade. And the UNFCCC Secretariat just released its interim synthesis sort of report of these NDCs on Friday, and the prediction is fairly grim. If we go beyond this and look at the net zero targets, because there's been a spate of net zero announcements by states, if we look at all of those, then we may well get to 2.1 degrees centigrade. But it's important to keep in mind that these net zero targets have not been embedded in long-term strategies of most states, and they're not necessarily complemented by short-term actions that are going to get states to these net zero targets by 2050 or 2060. Which leads me to the second gap, which is the accountability gap. There is no mechanism to generate accountability, individual accountability, either for targets taken in relation to ambition or in relation to fairness. States are supposed to provide information with their NDCs, but they can choose the informational requirements that apply to them. There is an enhanced transparency framework, but it was clearly negotiated to ensure there was no sort of content review function in that transparency framework. There is a compliance committee of which Christina is co-chair, and I'm sure she'll do a fantastic job. But ultimately, it's limited to ensuring compliance with a short list of binding procedural obligations. So the accountability for targets taken and their achievement is largely left outside the regime, right? And the third and very important gap is the fairness and equity gap. It's an issue that the Paris Agreement actually sidestepped because it is so contentious by adopting a sort of self-differentiation model. But it's not an issue that is going to die down. It's never going to go away. And it's cropping up in national litigation and regional litigation. Even the Portuguese children's case before the European Court of Human Rights, 33 European states are being asked the question, what is each state's fair share? And that's the fundamental question at the heart of it. And it's very hard for national courts to determine what a fair share is in the context of a collective action problem. You need a benchmark, right? So these are the three areas in which the ICJ, I think, could very usefully intervene. How could it do that? Because the Paris Agreement does not exist in isolation. These agreements and these procedural obligations don't exist in isolation. And the only body, in a sense, that can intervene and state the law on how these different bodies of law link together, whether it's human rights, or customary international law and sort of treaty law interact, is the ICJ. So what could it do here, right? So first, I think there are three things that it could do. First, it could interpret the provisions of the Paris Agreement, especially some of the obligations of conduct in it, in light of customary international law, which is in particular the harm prevention principle and the due diligence obligations that attach to it, which Christina has already mentioned. Due diligence is an inherently variable standard, but it is not infinitely malleable. So the ICJ could pronounce on exactly what the standard of due diligence needs to be in the context of obligations of conduct that exist in the Paris Agreement, right? So this would then have the effect of narrowing the discretion and autonomy that states have that are currently not being exercised in a way that would get us to 1.5 degrees, right? And I think the second aspect that the ICJ could usefully pronounce on, again, in the context of customary international law principles that apply here, are the customary international law principles of good faith and cooperation. And I think many of the provisions in the Paris Agreement rest on good faith expectations, a good faith expectation that every state, every successive contribution is going to reflect the highest possible ambition, is going to be progressive from its last, and such like. And what exactly does good faith mean in this context? What exactly does cooperation mean in this context? Again, narrowing the discretion and autonomy that states have, right? And the final area in which it could help is relating to the fairness question, is to pronounce on the legal status and operational significance of equitable principles of international environmental law. Equity, inter and intra-generational equity, that Solomon has spoken about, intra-generational equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, and even the principle of special circumstances. How do we interpret these provisions such that it helps us determine what obligations states have? And those obligations are not limited to the procedural obligations in the Paris Agreement. And I think that's the fundamental message that needs to come through. There is a spectrum of obligations that states have, some of which are captured in the Paris Agreement, and we need to read them all in sort of complement with each other to allow states to have a clear sense of what they need to do to address this challenge.
Yes, you're entirely right. I mean, there is a Paris Agreement and so on, but there is also all the customary international law that would be applicable law on a standalone basis as well. And one thing that you didn't mention that I can expect Solomon to be interested about is the issue of loss and damage. After all, I mean, one would expect, could the court be called, not within the Paris Agreement, because we have the famous Article 8 with the, I think it's the paragraph 51 or 52 of the decision of adoption, but what about loss and damage? Solomon, would be a decision of or an advisory opinion of the ICJ without any mention to loss and damage disappointing? I think you're muted, Solomon.
Sorry, Jorge. Could you reiterate the question, please?
Yes. What about loss and damage? To what extent an advisory opinion does not touch upon loss and damage directly or even indirectly would be a sort of disappointing for the youth that is driving this process?
Yes. Without the, thank you for that question, Jorge. Without the courts touching on loss and damage will be a significant disappointment, especially for countries in the developing nations. For Pacific Island states, without touching, the court is thus presented, if the ICJ were to go towards the court, it is presented with a historic responsibility to take shed some light on this important matter. Without the court addressing this, the issue of loss and damage, especially on how states get states could contribute, especially developed countries can really assist the needs and support the needs of developing countries, is something that needs to also be highlighted. But with missing this opportunity, it does really is not only a disappointment, but also slowing down the progress of the much needed support that developing countries really need in terms of addressing loss and damage.
Thanks, Solomon. Christina, what are your thoughts about this? Because, of course, I mean, on a purely academic perspective, and with the usual disclaimers applying, so what do you think would be a useful pronouncement on this dimension of due diligence by the court or other bodies?
I just wanted to go back to one of the points that Lavanya raised. I was listening very carefully, and I think she made a number of extremely important observations here. And one linking back to the need for clarification of commitments and obligations and normative guidance that is included in the Paris Agreement, because what we saw, what happened after the adoption of the Paris Agreement was this worldwide celebration, but immediately the discourse emerged that parties are free to do whatever they want. It's a bottom-up agreement and everything is nationally determined. But I had the feeling that, whoever was saying that did not really read all the paragraphs and articles in the Paris Agreement, because in Article 4, paragraph 4, we have squarely written black and white that each party's NDC will reflect its highest possible ambition and present a progression compared to the previous one. And this actually is a normative guidance and an obligation of conduct that parties cannot do just anything, but that they have to relate to that conduct. And although within the Paris Agreement's architecture, there is nothing that could review this requirement, it is still there. And of course, it's kind of flying under the radar because nobody really wants to be held accountable. But I think that is something that requires further just clarification, and it could come from an international announcement, for example, by the International Court of Justice, because it is something that can be used to give meaning to the due diligence requirements that we have in the customary rule of prohibition of significant transboundary harm. And that is another area, and Lavanya was very eloquent in explaining that, where we have an area of international law where we don't really have all the details in place, which is moving, which is developing, but what exactly is the content of that no harm rule, the prohibition of significant transboundary harm? What is the due diligence standard there? It is an evolving standard, and we had the ITLOS, the International Tribunal on Law to See, giving some indication of how it looks at the due diligence requirements under its jurisdiction. So it is a legal tool or instrument that needs further clarification, and something from the International Court of Justice could be very helpful in shedding more light on what it is in the context of climate change.
No, I definitely agree. And just one point before I move to the final question, which is an open question, and I will get that in a moment. But there is something very important to keep in mind, which is we're not, there are two things here that we have to look at very, very carefully. One is, as you were all saying, this issue of due diligence as enshrined carefully, but with certain clarity in the Paris Agreement text as such. So there is due diligence there with the highest, it's not high, it's highest. And that's very important in the Paris Agreement. So there is a standard of due diligence to be met in the Paris Agreement as such. And then there is a separate matter, which has two dimensions that can be connected to the Paris Agreement, but that requires, in fact, a standalone assessment, which is a principle that I would not characterize as a principle of transboundary no harm or transboundary significant harm, but the principle of prevention. Because this has changed a lot in the last years, in the last decades, at least since the 1996 advisory opinion of the ICJ. And here we're talking about very clearly about a principle that is about prevention. And the court would probably be together with the ITLOS. The ITLOS, of course, has already said something about it in the context of Article 192, the duty to protect and preserve the marine environment. But the principle of prevention as such, which has no spatial limitation transboundary, because it also applies to areas beyond national jurisdiction, and even areas that are disputed, as the ITLOS has mentioned, and other arbitral tribunals. I think that's a very important part of what the court could say in that connection. And just moving to the last question, which is really an open question, and is in a bit la question qui fâche, in French, the question that really raises the stakes and raises the eyebrows as well. So what about state responsibility? We have roughly 10 minutes. I would suggest that each of you uses 3 to state, what it comes out of your mind immediately. What about state responsibility? Will it feature there? how will it feature? Will it be a disappointing reference or an encouraging references? We have seen the ICJ being at very different extremes of disappointment or encouragement. So let me start perhaps with, just because you're in this order of my Zoom screen, let me start with Lavanya.
Thank you, Jorge. That's a difficult question, and you've sort of turned to me first. I think a couple of points that I'd like to make here. I think there is a possibility that the ICJ will address this issue, but I think it will be cautious about how it will address this issue, and I think perhaps justifiably so, because certainly the negotiations themselves have revealed a lot of political contestations around these issues. There are issues of historical responsibility, the challenge of ignorance. You know, there are a whole. It's a long-standing conversation that's occurred on some of these issues. So I think the court will probably be cautious about sort of treading, you know, on too many toes and in too hasty a fashion in this area. Having said that, however, it will certainly, I mean, there are legal issues involved here, and I think those legal issues it will sort of pronounce on. But the legal issue, one thing that will help with pronouncing those legal issues is the science to some extent. The science has developed, in particular, attribution science, right? So the questions of causality, for instance, which we debated endlessly and, you know, in circles for years, there is now science, and which will be included in the 6th assessment report, which shows the extent to which anthropogenic interference with the climate system is actually increasing the chances of many of these extreme weather events from occurring, which then makes the sort of, you know, causation between anthropogenic interference, which is coming from multiple sources, some more than others, some countries more than others, makes that line from that to the extreme weather events, to then the loss and damage that you were alluding to earlier. Those lines are just far easier to draw now because the science has advanced quite considerably. So that's really helpful. I think it could help the court. The other, I think, element, again, that could help the court, going back to the harm prevention principle, and I, of course, completely agree with you on the harm prevention sort of categorization of this principle, and the due diligence sort of standard that emerges from the obligations of conduct that attach to it, is the fact that, again, in relation to the science and the purpose of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees target, is that due diligence requires, I think one of the factors that it requires is an eye to that purpose of the Paris Agreement, right? So how do we determine the standard of due diligence? We have to determine that standard of due diligence based on the object, purpose, and goals of the climate change regime, which are captured in Article 2, well below 2 degrees centigrade, striving towards 1.5 degrees centigrade. And not just that, also the nature and extent of the harm that would ensue in the absence of due diligence, right? If states do not take their due diligence responsibilities seriously, what are the consequences? And science tells us what those consequences are: continued emissions plus severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts, right? And that's just the last IPCC report. It's only going to be even stronger in the next report. And the standard of due diligence requires states to sort of take incredibly stringent actions in this context, in the context of the goals and in the context of what would ensue in the absence of due diligence. I think these are elements that could help the court sort of found its state responsibility and loss and damage sort of opinion on far firmer footing. Thank you.
Yeah. In the order again, perhaps Christina.
Ask about state responsibility. You know, if we look at that secondary concept of state responsibility, it only comes in depending on what kind of claim you bring. What do you want with a claim or an advisory opinion? Is it compensation? Is it restitution? Is it maybe just an apology? Not just an apology. Apology is very important in international relations. This depends on whether we have to look at state responsibility or not, maybe even in a contentious case. Who knows where this is headed? But I just want to point to two aspects with regard to state responsibility. Yes, we need an internationally wrongful act, and we've discussed this up and down already. The second issue that Lavanya already alluded to is the question of causation. And I think here we are running into a fairly new challenge that we haven't really had in international environmental law, at least addressed by the International Court of Justice, and that is of a collective action problem where we have accumulative contributions over time and space to a challenge, to a potential harm or actual harm already happening. And in this setting, we can't just have a simple sine qua non condition where one action leads to exactly one consequence. It just doesn't fit in that accumulative action challenge. And I think here we have to look at, for example, criminal law, where we have a risk increasing theory that every contribution that actually increases the risk of harm is a contribution in terms of causality, but not in terms of sine qua non. So this requires some more innovative and wider thinking of the legal community of how to address that challenge from the perspective of causality. And the second one with regard to due diligence, and I completely agree what you said, Lavanya, and what you also said, Jorge, that we have to look at due diligence in terms of the goals of the Paris Agreement. And yes, we all talk about 1.5 degree, well below 2 degrees, but we have more guidance in the agreement, in particular in Article 4.1, which talks about rapid peaking and then deep reductions with the aim of balancing emissions and removals. And that is being specified by the IPCC 1.5 degree report, and probably will be specified even more by the sixth assessment report, that this means global carbon neutrality, a complete global phase out of CO2 emissions. And if you can't phase them out, the residual emissions have to be balanced by removals. This is where the world is supposed to be in 2050, which is only 30 years from now, less than 30 years from now. So we have a very clear indication where the worlds collectively need to go. And that, of course, has to be interpreted into the due diligence requirement as well, that some countries have to go faster and deeper in their emission reductions than others in order to allow others to also get there by 2050, other countries that need more time and maybe have a right to further development. But I think we have the science there and the guidance from the Paris Agreement, and all that informs that due diligence requirement.
Thank you, Christina. Solomon, what do you think?
I think those are really excellent points, and I have not much to add to, except on the fact that I think that this is an excellent opportunity that the ICJ could really can play a very effective role in assisting the world on understanding climate science. For instance, an eminent expert raised valuable insight on how the ICJ could potentially be asked to confirm if the ideal 1.5 degree Celsius target is recognized as an obligation under international law, and whether its implementation imposes obligation to reduce emissions, including, if necessary, the phasing out of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
Thanks very much, Solomon. So we're just at the end of this discussion, of this sort of roundtable, sort of global roundtable, because we're each in a different corner of the globe. Perhaps I just, to add my 2 cents on the issue of responsibility, I think that, of course, the court could avoid the issue entirely, or it could actually, at the other extreme, finger point states that have been responsible or could be responsible. I think that both are extremes that should be avoided. But I think that the court could certainly, and ordinarily, would not be a progressive, but it would be a normal and expectable step for the court simply to say, well, if you have been emitting a lot, well, you have harmed the environment a lot. It's not that much to expect or to ask. Thank you very much again to all 3 panelists. And let me just add before we close that there's going to be an option to continue the conversation during the ACL meeting. So I'm not sure exactly what the mechanics of that will be, but I guess they're going to be very user-friendly. And we all very much look forward to continue this conversation here at the ACL meeting and beyond. Thank you very, very much. Have a nice morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.